All right, hello and welcome everybody. Today we are back for chapters 10 and 11 of Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread. These two chapters are titled Agreeable Work and Free Agreement, and we're going to see again that there's going to be a lot of... it's Thomas Sowell, I believe, who says that all economics is a study of trade-offs, right? And what we end up seeing in these chapters in particular is Kropotkin completely ignoring the notion of trade-offs in economic planning or economic calculation. Of course, this is a problem. He's going to make a lot of, utopian demands, but there's not really going to be any way to pay for those demands, and he doesn't really seem to care that much. To be perfectly fair, though, by the end of chapter 11, he is talking about the voluntary nature, the necessity for the voluntary nature of the stuff he's proposing. So at least he's not as bad as the people who are saying, let's just, use violence and overthrow this, though it is hard to square that with his doctrine of expropriation. Anyway, let's get into it. Chapter 10, Agreeable Work. So, the first thing that Kropotkin claims here is that the emancipation from capital will make work more agreeable. What he's actually talking about seems to be making workplaces more comfortable, which is a different thing from work being agreeable. Even comfortable work has disutility, right? It'd be, say that you're in in an easy chair. There is going to be a point where you're going to want to stop editing manuscripts while sitting in an easy chair and maybe just sit in the easy chair as opposed to actually doing work. Disutility of labor is a real thing, and even if the labor is particularly comfortable or pleasing even, there's going to come a point where you don't want to do it anymore and you want to do something else. And that break-even point may be somewhere where your productivity is still relatively low. Now, but setting that aside, if we just talk about making workplaces more comfortable, it's still actually a pretty difficult problem. Making workplaces more comfortable requires great investments of capital, and it's not always feasible to do this. The capital doesn't always exist. The excess wealth doesn't always exist to make this happen, and making it happen everywhere all at once would be prohibitively expensive. Just to give a rather extreme example, if there was a subsistence farmer who insisted on not working while it was too hot, or while it was too cold, or while it was too early, or while it was too late, he'd simply starve to death. Moreover, improvements to comfort of the workplace are expensive. They effectively come out of the workers' compensation. We've had a discussion already about the discounted marginal value product of labor. It is possible for workers to have different preferences as to how much of their DMVP is given to them in pay versus other benefits. But the pay plus benefits can't go over the DMVP for very long, or else the company is going to go out of business. Now here's the point. As opposed to a centrally planned or centrally organized, or even like a whatever Kropotkin is kind of saying, things will just magically kind of work out. The free market allows different employers to experiment with different ratios of pay versus benefits. It allows workers, and here's the thing, right, is that the same ratio is not the same for every person. There are some people who really want a comfortable workplace, and there are some people who are really more interested in getting that extra payout, even if things are a little uncomfortable. And so, as opposed to a system where everything kind of goes to the same ratio, and some people are unhappy on one side and other people are unhappy on the other side, a free market allows not just employers to experiment with different ratios, but for different employers to maintain different ratios, and for employees to figure out, this company has a more comfortable workplace, and I enjoy that. And somebody else to say, well, I don't really care that much about being comfortable. I'm a strong, strapping young lad, and I'll go work for this company that pays me more. You can't do that in a centrally planned system or in a communal system, honestly, because all those things are going to move towards one standard. For more on this, there's an article called The Free Market and Job Safety by George Reisman that I think is worth taking a look at. Link in the description. Next up, Kropotkin makes a point about quieter machines breaking down less. That if a machine for a factory is making a lot of noise or vibrating a lot or spending a lot of excess heat, that's going to cause it to break down more often. This is, of course, again, a trade-off. And it's not always necessarily the case that, It's just better if you get rid of all the noise. Kropotkin is taking the word of some anonymous engineer who might not even really exist and generalizing it to all capital goods. This is not a good generalization to make. And he's ignoring possibly necessary trade-offs to deal with scarcity at the time of production. Everyone would love the most amazing, nicest, most powerful, most efficient dishwasher available. Everybody would love to have that. But the question is whether they're willing to part with the wealth required to produce it right now, right? The dishwasher is a capital good. It goes under your counter and you'll use it for 10 years. But you need to pay for it before it gets put there. And when I say pay for it, I don't just mean have the money. I mean that society has to have the resources to produce these very nice things en masse. And, if it doesn't have enough resources, you're going to have to make some cuts somewhere. Either fewer people will have them, or they'll be of lower quality, or they'll break down sooner, or something like that. This is kind of like, it's not exactly the same as, but it's kind of like the concept of planned obsolescence, combined in some degree with incompetent engineers. Now, planned obsolescence can't survive in a free market unless it's what the consumers actually want. And there are perfectly good reasons why a consumer would want planned obsolescence. There are things like technological advances that make it so that, I want to replace my computer every couple of years, right? Because the next one is going to cost the same amount of dollars, but it's going to be 100 times better, right? It's like, it's like assuming that everybody was happy with the iPhone 5, so to speak, right? And, a person with an iPhone 5 has no desire to upgrade to an iPhone 13. Well, I mean, whatever number they're at right now, right? There are certain times where it's like, I can upgrade. And so if the thing breaks down in a much, much, much longer period than that upgrade period, then actually resources have been wasted, because what's going to happen is that the person's going to buy a new iPhone 13 and throw away his iPhone 5, which still had 100 years of good operation in it. The other thing, another factor in this might be fashion, right? And again, this is something where a free market can do a lot of good, because there can be clothes that are not designed to be fashionable and can be very durable, but there can also be clothes that are designed to be very fashionable, and the fashions change every year or every season or something like that. And so the clothes don't need to last that much longer than that. In fact, the people who buy them prefer for them to break down in that period of time, so they don't have to have, a million bell-bottom pants in their closet just gathering dust. There are cases where planned and I mean, you can have unplanned obsolescence too, where things just like, where we made it this way and it's going to last about 7 years and there's not much we can do about that. Lithium batteries are a good example of this. A lot of devices these days have these integral lithium batteries, and those batteries don't last much longer than 5 to 10 years on average, with frequent use especially. So there's reasons why you would want things to not last forever, necessarily. There's a great article by Lou Rockwell called The Myth of Planned Obsolescence. I'll have a link in the description. Next up, Kropotkin discusses the domestic slavery of women. It's worth noting that he already proposed replacing this slavery with compulsory work educating and raising children. And it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It doesn't make that much of a difference to the poor ladies who are moving from one kind of drudgery to another. But again, Kropotkin is relying on these weird, starry-eyed ideas of mechanization to solve the housekeeping problem. Of course, destroying all the market mechanisms that encourage the development and innovation and expansion of the capital structure will result in less mechanization, not more. There's a little point here where he talks about communal kitchens. Again, I think he says, 50 fires burn where one would suffice. Kropotkin on cooking. Just put the seasoning you like on at the very end, and it's all the same. I don't know whether this snuck into my notes for last week's episode by mistake. Maybe it was so silly that I couldn't help throw it into my notes. Or maybe Kropotkin's repeating himself. Either or. It's not particularly good for his arguments. All right. In the next chapter, pretty sure this is where the chapter changes over, we got free agreement. Kropotkin laments that the media focus too much on actions of government as being the only ones worthy of note. He's talking about newspapers, talking about this is what Congress did, this is what the Parliament did, whatever. while the newspapers ignore spontaneous groups' accomplishments. He notes that the system of railroads in Europe were constructed by many different organizations that operated relatively independently, but also ended up cooperating at their boundaries because it was incentivized to do so. What he's doing here is he's basically trumpeting the value of laissez-faire, despite my suspicion that European railroads were not entirely a free market creation. But the value of laissez-faire is not in the creation of groups that may or may not make deals with each other. It's voluntary trade. And voluntary trade is dependent on private property ownership. One cannot trade with what one does not own, right? And so expropriating all capital goods, all property, even personal property, is going to make it much less likely that these organic agreements are going to happen. What instead is going to happen is that someone's going to, what's most likely going to happen is that nothing's just going to get done at all, right? Nobody's going to lay any railroad because it sucks to lay a railroad. They'll want to, write screenplays instead. But even if we get away from the issue of the disincentive of productivity, what's going to end up happening is that there's going to be some central group that hands out all the railroad ties, and they're going to be encouraged and incentivized to hand them all out to one particular group. That's going to be the problem, and that group's not going to have to agree with anybody. Remember, expropriating capital goods from those who have built them up over time and spent the savings required to earn them puts them into less adept hands. Expropriating personal comforts will tend to result in the production of fewer personal comforts. Expropriation is the antithesis of private property. Kropotkin doesn't deny this, but he doesn't understand the implications of it, apparently. What it does, basically, it destroys from below the entire scaffolding, which is personal savings, investment, voluntary trade, Pareto positive interactions, and capital production. It's like Kropotkin wants the beautiful views from the top of the Empire State Building with no building below to actually hold you up. It's a very strange perspective where, because he's so economically illiterate, he's like, well, we just have the balcony, and the balcony is 800 feet up, and people can look at the over the skyline that way. It's like, well, but there needs to be a building under the balcony. He's like, no, we get rid of the building. We just have the balcony there. It's very stupid. Next up, ironically, Kropotkin correctly attributes monopolistic behaviors to the state. And then he goes on to spout again about how capital does the oppressing, which, he was almost there, and then he, turns off into his idiotic cul-de-sac. He's like a dog clawing at a stick rather than the man beating him with the stick. He attributes all these negative things to capital itself when he's, this close to being like, oh, state monopoly is doing a lot of this negative stuff. It must be capital. That's fine. Next, Kropotkin describes how guilds or syndicates will keep things like traffic organized and orderly without the state. He talks about, obstruction of a canal. Quote, obstruction was thus avoided even though the competition between the private owners of the boats continued to exist. Were the latter suppressed, the private ownership, the agreement would have been only the more cordial, end quote, he said, without making an argument. He spent some time talking about lifeboats and lifeboat associations and a bunch of private voluntary associations. It's worth noting, for instance, and there's a lot of holes in this, but the biggest one is basically this. Think about the lifeboat association and how much more poorly they would have worked if some rando could walk in and expropriate their resources. It's very puzzling that Kropotkin doesn't make this connection. It's like, well, wait. If property is theft, then this lifeboat association can't maintain its hold on these particular resources that it's using to promote lifeboats. So we need private ownership of these things. And ownership by a guild or a syndicate is the same thing as private ownership. It's just with more steps. Kropotkin seems to be assuming that these voluntary associations will be able to enforce their private ownership of capital goods, but that's just kind of something that you can break down with reductio ad absurdum. These voluntary associations will become the capitalists that Kropotkin fears, and they might even become the state. There's no reason to assume that a voluntary association won't act in the self-interest of its members. Thus, all of the incentive arguments about productivity come back. That is to say, if this small group of people gets together, they're going, and because they're a small voluntary group, they're able to hold property, right? They're going to do the same thing that an individual would basically, which is serve their own interests. Moreover, how will multiple voluntary associations handle unequal distributions of substitutable capital goods between them? Expropriation? Well, that sounds like a recipe for coercion. Group A and Group B start quibbling over a particular iron ingot or something like that. The rest of Chapter 11 is actually more about how these voluntary associations really manage to get things done, and how even the state is leaving more and more to these private individuals. From a free market, laissez-faire perspective, from a libertarian perspective, the second half of Chapter 11, there's almost nothing to complain about. But the problem, of course, is that Kropotkin wants the balcony without the building below it. And, there's even a lot in Chapter 11 that you can agree with. It's like, well, yeah, the state can't do these things, and so it hands off the ability to do it to these voluntary associations. Great, that's voluntary. It's when he starts talking about expropriation, it's like, well, there's no way to make expropriation voluntary. There's no way to hide the negative incentives of expropriation of property, and there's no way to hide the incentives of making it so that only certain groups can avoid expropriation. It doesn't make any sense. So this is a short one, kind of, because Chapter 12 is called Objections or something like that. It's where he starts taking on very seriously the objections to anarcho-communism, and it's not good, but it's going to take some time to poke at. So yeah, we're going to stop here for today. Chapters 10 and 11, agreeable work and free agreement. Lots of really, really basic economic failings here. A lot of economic illiteracy, a lot of weird exceptions, and a lot of generalizing things that maybe can't be properly generalized. Yeah. And he gets this close to being like, oh, if we just have private property and no monopolization enforced by the state, then he's almost there. And then he wanders off into, let's have a lifeboat association or something. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. We'll continue with Chapter 12, Chapter 13 maybe next time. We'll see how long those notes end up. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you like this channel and you like what I'm doing, feel free to, do whatever it is that you want to do to help the channel out. As always, there's going to be, full notes over on the blog post. Links in the description for places to go read and kind of deepen or widen your knowledge. And have a good rest of your week. And actually, I might have something else coming out later this week, but I'm not sure. We'll see. Anyway, have a good week, and I'll see you later.